Welcome to the Moonlit Archive. Tonight's entry, the Statue of Zeus at Olympia. The god was too big for his temple. The ancient geographer Strabo wrote that if Zeus had risen from his throne, if this statue of gold and ivory had simply stood erect, he would have unroofed the building that housed him. The ceiling would have cracked. The walls would have buckled outward. The structure that the greatest architects in Greece had built to honor him could not have contained him had he chosen to stand. For 800 years, pilgrims traveled from every corner of the Greek world to stand before this figure. They came from Athens and Sparta, from the islands of the Aegean and the distant shores beyond. They crossed mountains and sailed through storms. They walked for weeks along dusty roads, protected by a sacred truce that silenced all the wars of Greece. And when they finally entered that temple, when they passed through the great bronze doors and looked up into the dimness of the inner chamber, they wept. Not children, not the faint of heart. Generals who had commanded armies wept. Philosophers who had trained their minds to resist all emotion wept. Hardened travelers who had seen every marvel the ancient world could offer stood before this statue, and their eyes filled with tears. The Roman general Aemilius Paulus, a man who had conquered kingdoms and marched his legions across half the known world, came to Olympia specifically to see this statue. He was moved, the ancient writers tell us, to his very soul, as if he had seen the god in person. As if gold and ivory had somehow become flesh and divinity, right there in the dimness, right there before his eyes. The philosopher Dio Chrysostom declared that a single glimpse of the statue would make any mortal forget all the terrors and hardships that fall to our human lot. Forget them entirely. Not push them aside, not distract from them, but erase them as if they had never been. Pliny called it a work of art which no one ever equaled. We will come back to that, to why they wept. It is worth understanding, and understanding takes time. But first, the mystery. Because there are two mysteries here, tangled together like the roots of the ancient olive trees that grew in the valley where the statue stood. The first mystery is this: the statue is gone. It stood for more than 8 centuries, outlasting empires, surviving earthquakes and war and the slow erosion of everything around it. Generations of priests cared for it. Generations of visitors marveled at it. It was the most celebrated sculpture in the entire ancient world. And then one day, it vanished. Gold and ivory and cedarwood, all of it consumed. Whether by fire in its own temple or by flames in a distant palace, we cannot say with certainty. The sources disagree, the evidence is incomplete, the wonder simply disappeared. The second mystery concerns the man who made it. He was the greatest sculptor the ancient world ever produced. His name was Phidias, and he created works so magnificent that people said he had looked upon the gods themselves, or perhaps that the gods had looked upon his work and recognized themselves in it for the first time. He was the friend of statesmen, the confidant of the most powerful man in Athens, the master of a workshop that transformed raw materials into divinity. But he died under circumstances that remain unclear to this day. Accused of crimes, imprisoned, perhaps executed, the stories contradict each other. History remembers his masterpiece in loving detail, but cannot agree on how its maker met his end. Two mysteries then: a vanished wonder and a lost creator. A god who burned and a sculptor who disappeared into the silence of conflicting accounts. But there is a third thing beyond the mysteries, beyond the questions of what happened and how it ended. There is the question of what it was like, what it felt like to stand before that statue in the dimness of the temple, to look up at 40 feet of gold and ivory, to see the god's face gazing down at you with an expression that seemed to say, "I know you. I have always known you, and you have always known me, though you did not know it until now." That is what we are really here for tonight. Not the history, though the history is remarkable, not the archaeology, though the archaeology is fascinating, but the experience, the feeling, the thing that made hardened men weep and that philosophers could not explain. Tonight, we journey to that place between memory and dream, to a sacred valley in the western Peloponnese, where two rivers meet beneath groves of ancient olive trees, to a green and gentle landscape where the hills rise softly on three sides, and the air smells of wild thyme and warm stone. We journey to Olympia, and to the wonder that once dwelt there. The statue of Zeus. There is no test tomorrow, no notes to take, no need to remember anything at all. Simply rest and let the story carry you, like water flowing through an ancient grove. If you fall asleep, the story will still be here. It has waited 2,500 years. It can wait a few hours more. And if you stay awake, that is fine too. Either way, the rivers of Olympia are flowing. The olive trees are rustling in the warm air. The god is sitting on his throne, patient as only gold and ivory can be, waiting for you to arrive. Close your eyes if you have not already, or leave them open, it makes no difference. The story works in both directions. It does not require darkness to take you where it is going, and it does not require light. Let us go there now, together, slowly, with nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. Let us begin with the land itself, with the olive trees and the rivers, with the valley the Greeks held sacred above almost all others, and with a secret about those olive trees, a secret of preservation that will matter more than you might expect. Before there was a temple, there was a grove. The Greeks called it the Altis, the sacred precinct. It was a place of olive trees and plane trees, of soft grass and dappled sunlight, where two rivers met, and the hills rose gently on three sides. The hill of Kronos stood to the north, named for the father of the gods, that ancient Titan who had ruled the world before his son overthrew him, and established a new order among the heavens. Gentler slopes enclosed the valley to the east and south, sheltering it from the worst of the winter storms, while allowing the summer breezes to pass through. Olympia was never a city. That is the first thing to understand about it, the thing that made it different from every other important place in the Greek world. No merchants hawked their wares in permanent shops because there were no shops. No families raised children within its walls because it had no houses. No politicians argued in its assembly because it had no assembly. It was a sanctuary, pure and simple, a place set apart from the ordinary world, dedicated to powers greater than anything human. The only permanent residents were the priests who tended the altars and the servants who maintained the sacred buildings. Everyone else, the athletes who came to compete, the spectators who came to watch, the merchants who set up temporary stalls during the great festivals, came and went with the seasons, like birds migrating to a shore they could not explain their need for. Two rivers shaped this valley, and they shaped everything that happened here. The Alpheus was the larger of the two. It rose far to the east in the mountains of Arcadia and flowed westward through the heart of the Peloponnese. By the time it reached Olympia, it had gathered the waters of many tributaries and grown into a broad, gentle stream. In summer, it flowed warm and shallow, its waters heated by the Greek sun, its current slow enough for a child to wade across. In winter, when the mountain snows melted and the rains came heavy, it could swell and surge, spreading across the valley floor in floods that deposited rich layers of silt upon the land. The Greeks told stories about the Alpheus. They said the river god fell in love with a water nymph who fled from his advances all the way to the island of Sicily. The god pursued her even there, his waters flowing beneath the sea to emerge in a spring near Syracuse. It was a story of persistence, of love that crossed oceans and would not be denied. The kind of tale the Greeks loved to tell because it dressed the mysteries of nature in the clothing of human emotion. If you could have sat beside the Alpheus on a summer evening, you would have watched the water slide past in sheets of amber and gold, catching the last light of the day. The sound it made was particular, not the rush and tumble of a mountain stream, but the deeper, steadier voice of a river that has found its pace and settled into it. A murmur, a continuous, unhurried conversation between water and stone that had been going on for millennia and would continue for millennia more, regardless of who listened. The Cladios was smaller. It flowed down from the western hills, joining the Alpheus just below the sacred precinct. Its waters were cooler, fresher, drawn from springs that never ran dry even in the brutal heat of summer, when other streams shrank to trickles and stagnant pools. The Greeks believed that springs were sacred, openings in the earth through which the hidden world communicated with the visible one. Together, the two rivers made the valley fertile. They watered the olive groves and the meadows, the plane trees and the wild herbs that grew along their banks. They provided drinking water for the thousands of visitors who came during the festivals, and bathing water to wash away the dust of long journeys. And they brought to the place a particular quality of air, moist and fragrant, alive with the scent of growing things, perfumed with the particular green sweetness that rises from land where water runs clean and close to the surface. The rivers also brought danger. Over the centuries, their floods deposited layers of silt across the valley floor. Slowly, imperceptibly, the land level rose. Temples that once stood proud above the ground gradually sank, their foundations buried under accumulating sediment. But that danger would not reveal its full consequences for centuries, a slow burial that would erase the sanctuary from the surface of the earth. We will come to that in time. The olive trees. Let us speak of them for a moment, because they will matter later in ways you might not expect. They grew everywhere in the Altis. Some were very old, so old that no one could say when they had been planted, their trunks gnarled and twisted by centuries of sun and wind into shapes that seemed almost human, almost animal, almost like the forms of sleeping creatures frozen in wood. The olive was sacred to the Greeks. In Athens, they said the goddess Athena had given them the first olive tree as her gift to the city, planting it on the Acropolis in a contest with another god for the right to be the city's patron. Here at Olympia, an ancient wild olive grew near the great altar, and its branches were used to weave the crowns for victors in the games. The olive provided everything. Its fruit was food. Its oil was fuel for lamps, a base for perfumes and medicines, a lubricant for machinery, a preservative for leather and wood. Athletes rubbed it on their bodies before competition, their skin gleaming in the sun like polished bronze. The wealthy anointed themselves with perfumed oil after bathing. The poor used cruder versions for cooking and for the single lamp that lit their homes after dark. And the priests of Olympia used olive oil for something else entirely, something we will come to in time. A secret of preservation that kept the wonder alive for 800 years, long after it should have crumbled into dust. Legend told that the king of the gods himself had chosen this place. Some said it was here that he wrestled his father Kronos for dominion over the universe, the old Titan against his youngest son, the old order against the new, with the fate of all creation hanging in the balance. Others said it was here that the divine hero first established the games in honor of the god. The myths intertwined and contradicted each other, as myths always do. What mattered was not the precise story but the feeling, the sense that this ground was holy, that the boundary between mortal and immortal grew thin in this green valley between the rivers, that something lived here that could not be named or measured, but only felt. Imagine arriving at Olympia for the first time. You have travelled for weeks, perhaps. If you came from Athens, you crossed the great isthmus and walked the dusty roads of the Peloponnese, past villages of whitewashed houses, past fields where goats grazed on scrubby hillsides, past rocky landscapes that shimmered in the heat. If you came from one of the distant Greek colonies, from the shores of the Black Sea or from Sicily or from the African coast, you sailed across waters that Homer called wine dark, and then continued overland through unfamiliar country. The journey was hard. The roads were rough, unpaved tracks that turned to mud in winter and to clouds of choking dust in summer. Bandits sometimes lurked in mountain passes, waiting for travelers who carried money or goods worth stealing. But you were protected by the sacred truce, the echecharia that shielded all travelers to and from the games. For the duration of that truce, which could last as long as 3 months, no Greek state was permitted to make war upon another. No army could march. No weapons could be carried into the territory of Elis. It was one of the few times that the often warring Greeks set aside their differences. They fought constantly, these people. City against city, alliance against alliance, brother against brother, generation after generation. Violence was woven into the fabric of their civilization as deeply as poetry and philosophy. And yet, for a few weeks every 4 years, they remembered that they were one people, united by language and religion and culture, even when they fought. And so you walked in peace through landscapes that might otherwise have been battlefields. You walked alongside strangers who in another month might be enemies, soldiers from rival cities, merchants from competing ports, citizens of states that had been at war for generations. But here, under the protection of the truce, you were all simply travellers, all heading in the same direction, all drawn by the same pull. The journey had its own rhythm. Walking through the Greek countryside, you fell into a pace dictated by the landscape itself. Uphill in the morning when the air was cool and your legs were fresh. Rest during the heat of midday in the shade of whatever trees presented themselves. Walk again in the late afternoon when the shadows lengthened and the light turned golden. Sleep under the stars or in whatever lodging the small towns along the way could offer. As you approached the sanctuary, the land softened. The dry hills gave way to greener country. The sound of water reached your ears, the murmur of the Altis, broad and slow, flowing westward toward the sea. The air changed. It grew cooler, moister, fragrant with wild thyme and pine resin, with grass and distant flowers and the warm, slightly nutty scent of olive groves that had been growing in this valley since before your grandparents' grandparents were born. And then, rising above the trees, you saw it. The Temple of Zeus. Its columns caught the light and held it, pale and bright against the green of the valley. From a distance, it looked like a thing that had always been here, as natural as the hills, as permanent as the rivers, as much a part of the landscape as the olive trees that surrounded it. And yet you knew that human hands had built it. Human minds had conceived it. Human devotion had raised those columns toward the sky and placed within them a wonder that you had come very far to see. The temple was the largest in the Peloponnese. It rose from a platform of 3 stone steps, its columns reaching toward the sky like a grove of stone trees. 34 columns in all, 6 across the front, 6 across the back, 13 along each side. Each one stood more than 30 feet tall, carved from local limestone covered in white stucco that gleamed in the sun so brightly that travelers said they could see the temple's reflection shimmering in the air above it, like a mirage. An architect from the city of Elis designed it, according to principles of harmony and proportion that the Greeks held sacred mathematical relationships that they believed reflected the underlying order of the universe itself. The proportions were not arbitrary. They were calculated. The height of the columns bore a specific ratio to the width of the building. The spacing between the columns bore a specific ratio to their diameter. Every measurement was related to every other, in a web of mathematical harmony that the eye could feel even when the mind could not quite identify it. The columns swelled slightly in their middles, a technique called entasis, which counteracted an optical illusion that would otherwise have made them appear to pinch inward, to look thin and starved and weak. The platform curved almost imperceptibly upward at its center, again for optical reasons, so that the whole building seemed to sit more firmly on the earth, seemed more solid, more grounded, more permanent than a perfectly flat platform would have allowed. These refinements were invisible to most observers. You could stand before the temple for hours and never notice them. But they contributed to the building's effect, the sense that it was perfectly balanced, perfectly harmonious, perfectly right. The sense that it had always been here and always would be. The temple was built between 470 and 456 before the Common Era, a construction period of 14 years, during which the Valley of Olympia was transformed from a sacred grove, with a few modest buildings, into the most impressive religious site in the Peloponnese. Hundreds of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, labourers, sculptors, lived and worked in the valley for more than a decade, cutting and shaping and lifting, building a monument that they knew would outlast them. Its construction followed a great victory, the Greek triumph over a vast invading army at Plataea, which had ended the threat of Eastern conquest once and for all. The temple was in part a thanksgiving offering for that deliverance. It said, "We survived and we remember who saved us." It was also a statement of ambition, a declaration that the Greeks could build on a scale to match any empire, that their gods deserved temples as grand as any in the world. The building materials tell their own story. The columns were carved from shell limestone, a local stone that was not beautiful in itself, but could be covered with stucco to create a smooth, white surface that time would weather to a warm cream. The Greeks did not leave their temples the bare stone colour we see in ruins today. They painted them, brightly, boldly, in reds and blues and golds, decorated them with patterns and symbols, made them blaze with colour against the blue sky. Our image of austere white Greek temples is a modern invention, a misunderstanding born of ruins stripped bare by centuries of weather. The reality was far more vivid. The roof was tiled with marble, precious marble, brought from distant quarries at great expense. Those tiles gleamed in the sun, white and pure, visible for miles around, a beacon that drew the eye of every traveller approaching through the olive groves. The pediments, those great triangular spaces at each end of the roof, were filled with sculptures depicting scenes from myth. On the east pediment, the one that visitors would see as they approached, was a tale of chariot racing and divine intervention that explained why the games were held at this place. On the west was the battle between civilization and chaos, the struggle of human order against the wildness that always threatens to overwhelm it. The metopes, rectangular spaces above the columns, depicted the 12 labours of the divine hero who was the god's own son, and who had, according to legend, founded the games. Each metope showed a different labour: the slaying of a lion, the capture of a bull, the descent into the underworld. Some of these metopes survive today, recovered by archaeologists from the mud that buried them, and even in their damaged state, they convey a power and a dignity that 2,500 years of burial could not diminish. Every element of the temple told a story. Every sculpture reinforced a message. This was not mere decoration, but belief made visible, the faith of the Greeks given form in stone. And the message, taken together, was consistent. The world is a place of struggle, but order prevails. Chaos threatens, but civilization endures. The god watches over it all, and in the end, the right side wins. Here is something worth knowing, if you are still awake to hear it. Something that the architects understood and that most visitors never noticed. The floor of the temple was not level. It was designed with a barely perceptible curve, a gentle rise toward the center, measured in fractions of an inch, so subtle that no human eye could detect it by looking. And yet the body could feel it. When you walked the length of the cellar, the inner chamber where the statue sat, you were always, without knowing it, walking slightly uphill toward the god. Your body leaned forward just barely. Your step quickened just slightly. Your center of gravity shifted in ways you could not consciously perceive. The architecture itself was guiding you, drawing you forward, creating anticipation in your muscles before your mind had caught up. And the drainage, the mathematics of the drainage. Rainwater that fell on the temple floor did not pool. It followed channels cut into the stone, invisible to the eye, flowing outward toward the edges, keeping the sacred space dry even during the winter storms. The angles of those channels were calculated with a precision that modern engineers still admire. Not a puddle, not a damp spot. The water simply vanished, drawn away by geometry and gravity into gutters that no visitor ever saw. The Greeks understood something that we sometimes forget: that the best design is the design you never notice. That the highest art is the art that seems effortless, that moves you without your permission, that shapes your experience so subtly that you attribute the effect not to the architect's skill, but to the god's presence. Let us enter the temple. We pass between the great columns of the front porch. The shade is welcome after the brightness outside, that sudden coolness that Greeks associated with the threshold between the mortal world and the divine. Before us are the great doors, massive, heavy, made of wood sheathed in bronze. When they swing open, they do so slowly, ponderously, with a deep resonant sound that echoes through the chamber beyond, announcing your arrival to whoever or whatever waits within. We step through. The cellar stretches before us. It is divided into 3 aisles by 2 rows of columns, more slender than those outside, double stacked in 2 tiers, rising toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The effect is of a stone forest, a sacred grove made permanent in limestone and stucco. The light is dim. The only illumination comes from the doorway behind us and from whatever light finds its way through openings in the roof. After the brightness of the Greek day, and the Greek day is bright, fierce, merciless in its clarity, The temple's interior seems almost dark, a twilight space, a threshold between worlds. Your eyes need time to adjust. This is not a design flaw. It is the design itself. The darkness is deliberate. The architects understood that the transition from light to shadow was part of the experience, that the moment of blindness when you first entered, the gradual emergence of shapes from the gloom, the slow revelation of what lay at the far end of the chamber. All of this was preparation. The temple was teaching you to see differently. Teaching your eyes to seek light in a place where light was scarce, where every gleam and shimmer mattered, where the gold of the gods' robes would catch whatever illumination existed and magnify it into something approaching radiance. The smell is distinctive. Olive oil, primarily warm and slightly nutty, permeating the air, mingling with the scent of ancient cedarwood and cold stone and something else, something harder to name. The smell of centuries. The smell of a place that has been devoted to a single purpose for longer than most cities have existed. We walk forward between the columns, our eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness. The floor beneath our feet is paved with large blocks of stone, covered with a water-resistant lime coating. Our sandals whisper against it as we move. The sound carries in this space softly but distinctly. Every footstep has its echo. Every whisper travels to the far walls and returns, slightly changed, as if the temple were answering. Gallery railings line the upper tier of columns. In later centuries, visitors would climb stairs to these galleries, looking down on the statue from above, seeing the god from a vantage point that ground-level worshippers could never achieve. From up there, the full composition of the throne would have been visible: the painted screens, the decorative panels, the 8 dancing figures of Nike at the base of the throne's legs. A different view, and therefore a different experience. The Greeks understood that a statue seen from one angle is not the same statue seen from another. Each vantage point reveals something new. And there, at the far end of the chamber, for 20 years after the temple's completion, that space was empty. The inner chamber stood waiting, like a stage before the actors arrive, like a frame without its painting. There was an altar. There were offerings and dedications left by pilgrims who came to worship, even though the centerpiece was missing. But no statue, no cult image, no representation of the god to whom this magnificent building was dedicated. The people of Elis were waiting. They were waiting for someone worthy to create the image of their god. They were waiting for Phidias. He was the greatest sculptor of his age, perhaps of any age. The ancient writers spoke of him with awe that bordered on reverence. He had seen the gods, they said. Or perhaps, and this is the more remarkable claim, he had shown the gods what they truly looked like. His works were not mere representations but revelations, windows into something that existed beyond the reach of ordinary sight, beyond the capacity of ordinary hands to shape. He was born in Athens around 480 before the Common Era into a family of craftsmen. His father may have been a sculptor himself, the records are unclear, but the name appears in lists of Athenian artisans. The young man studied under 2 masters of the old school, learning the traditional techniques of bronze casting and marble carving that Greek sculptors had practiced for generations. The precise manipulation of the chisel, the mathematics of proportion. The slow, patient work of revealing the form that lay hidden within the stone. But he went beyond his teachers. In his hands, bronze and marble seemed to come alive. His figures had a presence, a gravity, a sense of inner life that other sculptors could not match. no matter how perfect their technique. It was said that he could capture not just the shape of a god but the godhood itself, that elusive quality of divinity that resists all attempts at definition, that you know when you feel it but can never quite describe. His rise coincided with the rise of Athens under the statesman Pericles. Pericles was one of those rare men who combined political genius with genuine cultural vision. He saw Athens not merely as a powerful city-state, though it was that, commanding a naval empire across the Aegean, but as the school of all Greece. A place where the highest achievements of human civilization could flourish, where architecture and sculpture, philosophy and theatre, poetry and music could reach heights never before imagined. And he recognized in the young sculptor a kindred spirit, someone whose ambitions matched his own, whose vision was equally vast, whose standards were equally uncompromising. Around 449 before the Common Era, Pericles placed him in charge of all the artistic projects in Athens. It was an extraordinary commission, a staggering vote of confidence in a single artist. One man given oversight of some of the most ambitious building programs in the history of the world. The construction of temples, the carving of sculptures, the painting of walls, the design of processional routes and public spaces, all of it under one vision. All of it driven by one man's understanding of what beauty could achieve. And Phidias delivered. He gathered around him the finest craftsmen in Greece, sculptors and painters, bronze workers and carvers of ivory, architects and engineers and men who worked in materials so specialized that we no longer even have names for their trades. He organized them. He inspired them. He held them to standards that must have seemed impossible until they were met, and then seemed inevitable. Chief among the projects was the Parthenon. The Parthenon was a temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the patron deity of Athens. It rose atop the Acropolis, that great rock that dominated the city, visible from miles away in every direction. Its marble columns, refined with the same subtle mathematics of entasis and curvature used at Olympia, have influenced architects ever since. They stand today, even in ruin, as one of the most recognized structures on Earth. And within the Parthenon stood the sculptor's first great chryselephantine statue, the Athena. She was magnificent, nearly 40 feet tall, towering over the worshippers who entered her temple, dwarfing everything in the chamber, filling the space with a presence that was both maternal and martial. Made of gold and ivory over a wooden frame, chryselephantine, the Greeks called this technique, from their words for gold and ivory, chrysos and elephantinos. In her right hand she held a figure of Nike, the goddess of victory. On her left arm she bore a great shield decorated with scenes of battle, gods against giants, Greeks against their legendary enemies. On her head she wore a helmet crowned with a sphinx and flanked by griffins, the creatures of myth guarding the goddess of wisdom. The gold alone weighed more than 1,000 kilograms, a fortune by any measure, enough to fund an army or build a fleet of warships. It was designed to be removable, so that it could be weighed if the city ever needed to verify that none had been stolen. This was a practical consideration, a concession to the realities of Athenian politics, where accusations of corruption were a favorite weapon of ambitious men. The ivory panels that formed her face and arms were carved and fitted with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. She glowed in the dim interior of the Parthenon, gold catching what little light entered through the doorway, ivory radiating a warmth that seemed to come from within. Visitors spoke of her not as a statue, but as the goddess herself, dwelling in the temple that had been built for her, present in a way that no marble or bronze image had ever achieved. The Athena was dedicated in 438 before the Common Era. The people of Athens gathered to see her unveiled, and for a moment, just a moment, the rivalries and anxieties of the city fell away. There was only the goddess, standing in her temple, golden and vast and impossibly present. And it was this achievement, this proven mastery of the chryselephantine technique, the art of working gold and ivory together on a colossal scale, that brought Phidias to the attention of the people of Elis. But the Athena also brought him enemies. In the political world of Athens, where ambition was sharp and alliances shifted like sand, the sculptor's closeness to Pericles made him a target. Those who wished to wound the statesman but could not attack him directly turned instead to the people around him, his friends, his associates, his allies in the great cultural project. The sculptor was accused of embezzlement, of stealing some of the gold that had been entrusted to him for the Athena. It was an accusation designed not to punish the artist but to embarrass the patron. The gold was weighed, and the accusation was shown to be false. Phidias had designed the golden plates to be removable precisely so they could be weighed, precisely to guard against such charges. But the cloud of suspicion did not lift easily. Other accusations followed. Politics in Athens was not a gentle art. It consumed the people it touched. We will return to this, to what happened to the sculptor after his greatest triumph, and how the story of the man diverged from the story of his creation. Word spread through the Greek world, as word always spreads when something remarkable happens. Travelers who had seen the Athena described her in marketplaces and at dinner tables, in temples, and at the harbours where ships loaded and unloaded the goods of a dozen nations. And in Elis, the city that administered the sanctuary of Olympia, a thought began to take shape, a thought that was also a prayer and also an ambition. They wanted something even greater. They wanted the king of the gods himself, not a goddess of wisdom, however magnificent, but the ruler of heaven and earth, the father of gods and men, the one before whom all other deities bowed. For 20 years their temple had stood without a cult statue. For 20 years they had been searching for the right sculptor, the right vision, the right combination of skill and daring, and this mattered most, the right understanding of what a god should look like. And now they had found him. We do not know exactly how the commission came to him. Perhaps the Eleans sent emissaries to Athens, seeking an audience with the famous sculptor. Perhaps he himself expressed interest, having completed the Athena and looking for a new challenge, a challenge worthy of his gifts, a subject vast enough to contain everything he had learned and imagined and dreamed. What we know is that Phidias came to Olympia. He left Athens, whether willingly or under compulsion, we shall discover later, and travelled to the sanctuary in the western Peloponnese. It was a journey of several days, through country he may not have known well, to a place he had perhaps heard described but never seen. When he arrived, he would have found the temple standing complete but incomplete, a magnificent shell awaiting its heart. He surveyed the temple, measured its dimensions, studied its light at different times of day. He must have stood in the empty cellar for hours, at dawn, when the first golden rays pierced the doorway and travelled the length of the floor. At midday, when the light was harshest and the interior darkest by contrast. At evening, when the last slanting beams crept along the western wall and then withdrew, leaving the chamber to its shadows. He observed how the sun entered through the great doorway. He noted how the shadows moved across the interior as the hours passed. He considered what kind of statue could fill that space, could command that interior, could make visitors feel what he wanted them to feel. And he made a decision that would shape everything that followed. The statue would be seated. A standing figure, however magnificent, would be lost in the vertical space of the temple. The eye would travel upward along the body and find only darkness above the head. The effect would be one of incompleteness, of reaching towards something that could not be grasped, of a form diminished rather than enhanced by its setting. But a seated figure could fill the space differently. The horizontal mass of a great throne could anchor the composition, spreading it across the width of the chamber. The figure could rise to the very ceiling without seeming truncated or cramped. The whole ensemble, God and throne together, could create a presence that dominated the chamber completely, that left no empty space, no void, no corner where the eye might wander and find distraction. And there was another consideration, perhaps the most important one. A seated God is a ruling God. He is not striding into battle or hurling thunderbolts. He is not flexing his muscles or displaying his power through action. He is holding court, receiving homage, dispensing judgment. The pose conveys authority and permanence, the settled power of one who has no need to prove himself, who sits at the center of everything and need never move because everything comes to him. This was how Phidias would show the king of the gods, not as a warrior but as a sovereign, not as a force of nature but as the principle of order itself, calm, eternal, complete. There is something about a seated figure that invites contemplation rather than excitement. A standing figure engages you dynamically. You want to move around it, to see it from different angles, to match its energy with your own. A seated figure invites you to be still, to stop, to stand before it and simply look. This is what the sculptor wanted, not excitement, not drama, but stillness. The kind of stillness that allows something deeper to happen, a recognition, a connection, a moment when the boundary between viewer and viewed grows thin, and something passes between them that neither could have predicted. And so the decision was made. The God would sit, and the world would come to him. Before the statue could be created, a place was needed in which to build it. A chryselephantine statue on the scale Phidias envisioned could not be assembled in an ordinary workshop. It required space, vast amounts of space, and it required that the space match exactly the dimensions of the chamber where the statue would stand. If the sculptor built the statue in a room of different proportions, he would have no way of knowing whether it would fit, whether the proportions would be right, whether the figure would fill the space as he intended, or leave awkward gaps that would diminish the whole effect. And so the Eleans built him a workshop. They constructed it just west of the Temple of Zeus, outside the sacred precinct but close enough for convenience. And they built it to his precise specifications, the same dimensions as the temple's cellar, the same orientation, the same layout. The same width, the same length, the same height of ceiling. When Phidias worked on his statue, he would be working as if in the temple itself. Every proportion he judged by eye, every angle of light he considered, would translate directly to the final installation. This workshop was rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. They found it converted into a Christian church. Later generations had built over it, as later generations so often do, layering their own purposes atop the foundations of the past. But enough of the original structure remained to confirm its purpose and its dimensions. The workshop contained 3 naves, just like the temple's interior, divided by rows of columns. It had roughly the same floor space. The sculptor could build his colossal work in sections, assemble them, check the proportions against the space around him, and know with confidence that when the statue was finally installed in the temple, it would fit. Not approximately, exactly. And what the archaeologists found in that workshop told them much about how the master worked. They found ivory chippings, the pale debris from carving those plates that would form the god's skin. They found glass fragments and precious stones that would have adorned the throne. They found clay molds, dozens of them, that had been used to shape the gilded panels of the god's robes. The molds preserved the folds and drapes of the fabric in negative, like fossils of clothing that had never been worn by a living body. They found bone tools for delicate, fine work, the instruments of precision of finishing, of the last careful adjustments that separate competence from genius. They found a goldsmith's hammer, small and heavy. They found evidence of fires hot enough to melt glass, of abrasives fine enough to polish ivory to a mirror shine, of the vast and varied effort required to create a wonder. And they found something else. A small drinking cup, of the kind used throughout the Greek world. Common clay, ordinary shape, the kind of vessel that a man might drink from at the end of a long day's work without thinking about it twice. Ordinary in every way, except for what was inscribed on its bottom. 5 words. The archaeologists who found the cup turned it over in their hands, read the inscription, and understood immediately what they were holding. Not a treasure in the usual sense, not gold or ivory or precious stone. Something far more valuable to someone trying to understand the past. Proof. Direct, physical, undeniable proof that the ancient accounts were true. That this building was indeed the workshop of the most famous sculptor in history. That the stories handed down across millennia, copied and recopied by scribes in distant libraries, were not exaggerations or inventions but records of something real. We will return to those 5 words. They are small, you could cover them with the pad of your thumb, but they carry the weight of certainty. The kind of certainty that history rarely provides, and that, when it does provide it, feels almost like a gift from the past to the present. And so the gathering of materials began. This alone was a feat that stretched across the known world. For the framework, Phidias needed cedarwood, strong and aromatic, resistant to insects and decay, capable of holding its shape across centuries without warping or splitting. Cedar came from the mountains of distant lands to the east, carried by ship across the Mediterranean, traded through a network of merchants that connected the forests of the interior to the harbours of the coast, and from there to the workshops of Greece. For the skin, he needed ivory. Elephant ivory, specifically the tusks of African elephants, which in the 5th century before the Common Era still roamed in herds closer to the Mediterranean than they do today. The ivory trade was ancient and well established, bringing tusks from the interior of Africa through trading posts and caravan routes to the workshops of the Mediterranean world. A single tusk, even a large one, could not yield plates big enough for a statue 40 feet tall. Phidias would need many tusks, carefully selected for quality and colour and size, for the fine grain and warm tone that distinguished the best ivory from the merely adequate. For the robes and hair and throne's ornaments he needed gold, vast quantities of gold, hammered into sheets so thin that light could almost pass through them. The gold came from many sources, from the mines of Thrace and the northern kingdoms, from treasuries built up over generations of warfare and tribute, from offerings made to the gods across centuries of worship. When gold was given to the gods, the Greeks took it seriously. It was not spent frivolously. It was held, guarded, counted, and deployed only for purposes that honored the deity to whom it had been offered. And he needed other materials as well. Ebony for the throne, black and heavy, imported from the lands far to the south. Precious stones, garnets and amethysts, rock, crystal and coloured glass for decoration. Silver and copper and tin for the alloy work. Paints and dyes for the panels that would fill the spaces between the throne's legs. The statue was not merely a work of art. It was an economic endeavour of staggering scope, drawing on trade networks that spanned 3 continents, requiring resources that only a wealthy state, or a coalition of wealthy states, could provide. Think of the logistics: ships carrying cedar from the east, caravans bringing ivory from the south, gold arriving from the north in guarded convoys, weighed and sealed and counted at every stage of the journey. Glass and precious stones from workshops scattered across the Mediterranean. Iron and bronze from the foundries of the mainland. All of it converging on a small valley in the western Peloponnese, where a single man, one sculptor, one vision, was waiting to transform it into something the world had never seen. With all of this arriving at Olympia, carried on the backs of mules and in the holds of ships, traded and purchased and transporting across distances that would take weeks to travel, Phidias began. First came the framework. The cedarwood was shaped and joined into a skeleton that would support the entire statue. This was engineering as much as art, perhaps more engineering than art at this stage. The framework had to bear the enormous weight of the gold and ivory coverings. It had to be stable, rigid, immune to the small movements and settlements that could crack ivory plates or dislodge golden panels. It had to endure not for years but for centuries, in a climate that swung between summer heat and winter damp. The throne would have been built first. Its 4 legs, its seat, its back, its armrests, all formed from interlocking pieces of cedar, joined with wooden pegs and perhaps with iron clamps where extra strength was needed. Then the figure itself. The legs bent at the knee resting upon the throne's seat. The torso rising from the waist. The arms, one extended to hold Nike, the other gripping the scepter. The head turned slightly, crowned with an olive wreath. Each section was built separately, then fitted together to ensure alignment. The joints had to be invisible when the statue was complete. The figure had to appear to be made of continuous surfaces, not assembled from 100 pieces, but whole, organic, alive. Workers swarmed over scaffolding within the workshop. Carpenters shaped the cedarwood, their chisels and adzes ringing in the enclosed space. Joiners fitted the pieces together, testing and retesting the connections, ensuring that each joint was tight and true. Other workers prepared the surfaces, sanding, smoothing, creating the perfectly flat planes and perfectly curved surfaces over which the ivory and gold would later be applied. The workshop must have been an extraordinary place. Dozens of craftsmen working simultaneously, some on scaffolding high above the floor, others bent over workbenches along the walls, still others tending fires that kept the glues and adhesives warm and pliable. The smell of fresh-cut cedar, sweet and sharp, mingling with wood smoke and beeswax and the faint metallic tang of iron tools being sharpened on whetstones. The sound of hammers and chisels, of saws and rasps, of conversation and argument, and the occasional burst of laughter that accompanies any large group of men engaged in difficult work over long periods. The sight of the statue growing piece by piece, from a skeleton of wood into something approaching a god taking shape in the same space, where one day in the real temple, the finished figure would preside over the prayers and tears of centuries. The smallest error at this stage could ruin everything that followed. A joint that was off by the width of a finger could become a gap the width of a hand when the ivory was applied. An angle that was wrong by a single degree could throw the whole figure out of proportion, creating a subtle wrongness that would be felt by every visitor, even if no one could identify its source. Phidias supervised every detail. He was not merely a designer who handed off execution to others. He was present, involved, his hands as well as his eyes engaged in the work. His assistants included his brother, who would paint the decorative panels, and other craftsmen who had followed him from Athens, men who had worked on the Parthenon, who knew his standards and his methods, who understood the level of perfection he demanded. But the vision was his alone. The decisions were his alone. The responsibility, if anything went wrong, was his alone. Then came the ivory. Working ivory is a demanding craft. The material is hard and dense, harder than most woods, denser than you would expect from something that once grew from a living body. It is prone to cracking if handled improperly, if exposed to the wrong temperature or humidity, if carved with a tool that is even slightly dull. It must be worked with sharp instruments and steady hands. Any mistake is permanent. There is no filling or patching, no going back. A crack in ivory is a crack forever. But ivory has qualities that no other material can match. When polished, it has a warm, translucent glow that resembles living skin more closely than any stone or metal ever could. It catches light and seems to hold it, creating an effect of inner illumination, as if the surface itself were a source of gentle radiance rather than merely a reflector. In certain light, polished ivory appears almost to breathe. The Greeks had long recognized this property, using ivory for the faces and hands of their most sacred statues, reserving it for the images that were meant to feel the most alive. Phidias developed techniques for working ivory on a scale never before attempted. Consider the challenge. A single elephant tusk, even a large one from a full-grown bull, might yield plates a few inches wide and perhaps a foot or two long. A statue 40 feet tall would require surfaces measured in square feet, vast expanses of seamless, warm, glowing material. The face alone would have been several feet across. The hands would have been enormous, each finger the length of a man's arm. He would need many tusks, perhaps dozens, perhaps more, carefully selected for quality and size and colour, for the fine grain and warm tone that distinguished the best ivory from the merely adequate. Tusks from young elephants had a different grain than those from old ones. Tusks from different regions had subtly different colours. The sculptor needed consistency, needed all the ivory in the statue to match, to appear as one continuous surface, to maintain the illusion of living skin across every visible area of the god. A mismatch in colour between the face and the hands, or between one hand and the other, would destroy the illusion. The eye might not identify the problem consciously, but it would sense that something was wrong, that the skin was not alive, that the god was, after all, merely assembled from pieces. He would need to develop methods for joining smaller pieces into larger surfaces, for treating the ivory to make it pliable enough to bend over curved forms, for finishing it to a smooth and lustrous surface that concealed every seam and joint. To make the plates pliable, he soaked them in solutions. The ancient sources suggest various possibilities, from vinegar to animal glue to other preparations whose recipes have been lost. The softened ivory could then be bent and shaped, molded to fit the contours of face and hands and feet, worked into curves and hollows that dry ivory would have resisted and cracked. Smaller pieces were joined together with tiny pegs and careful adhesives, the seams polished until they nearly disappeared. The goal was a seamless surface, a skin that appeared to be a single organic whole, as if the god's face had grown from a single piece of ivory the size of a small boat. The ivory formed the god's face, his forehead and cheeks, his noble nose and strong chin. It formed the area around his eyes where the expression lived, where the difference between a serene god and a stern one was measured in fractions of an inch. It formed his hands, those enormous hands that held Nike and the scepter, hands large enough that a man could have stood in one palm, hands that were carved with the veins and tendons and subtle musculature of living flesh, as if blood still flowed beneath the ivory surface. It formed his feet, visible beneath the hem of golden robes, resting on an ornate footstool decorated with scenes of battle. Each plate of ivory, once carved and fitted into place, was adjusted with infinite patience. The sculptors would step back, view the surface from the distance at which visitors would see it, return to make adjustments so fine they could barely be seen up close. A fraction of a degree in the angle of a cheekbone, a slight deepening of the hollow beneath an eye. The faintest adjustment to the curve of a lip, changing the expression from contemplative to serene. A difference so subtle that most observers could never have articulated it, but that all would have felt. The work moved slowly. A face the size of a small room cannot be carved in a day or a week or a month. It emerges gradually, feature by feature, contour by contour, like something being revealed rather than created. When the ivory was in place, it was burnished, rubbed with oils and fine abrasives until it glowed with that characteristic warmth that the Greeks prized above all other surface qualities. The result was skin that appeared to breathe, skin that caught the dim light of the temple and held it, seeming to produce a gentle luminance of its own. Skin that made ancient viewers forget they were looking at a sculpture and believe for one suspended moment that they were looking at flesh. And then the gold. Gold is the most workable of metals. It can be hammered thin without breaking, thinner than paper, thinner than the petals of a flower, thinner than thought. It can be drawn into wire without snapping, bent and shaped and reformed again and again without losing its luster. It does not tarnish. It does not corrode. It does not fade. Gold found in Egyptian tombs after 3,000 years of burial gleams as brightly as the day it was placed there. The same gold that gleamed in the sun at Olympia in the 5th century, before the Common Era, would gleam with equal brilliance today, if it had survived. The Greeks had worked gold for millennia, creating jewelry and vessels of breathtaking delicacy. But Phidias was working on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted. The gold sheets were hammered thin, so thin that light could nearly pass through them, thin enough to be flexible, thin enough to be shaped over forms and to hold their shape without support. Gold of this thinness is measured not in weight but in surface area. Covering a statue 40 feet tall required an enormous expanse of golden fabric. The clay molds found in the workshop show how the robes were created. Forms were shaped to match every fold and drape of the god's clothing. Over these forms, the thin gold sheets were pressed and burnished, taking on the contours of the clay. The result was gold that looked like cloth that fell in naturalistic folds, that caught and released light as real fabric would, that seemed to move in a breeze that no one could feel. The robes were said to be embroidered with figures of animals and lily flowers, perhaps painted, perhaps inlaid, perhaps worked in relief with the finest tools. Imagine the skill required to render a lily in hammered gold, each petal curving naturally, each stamen precise, each leaf folded with the casual asymmetry of nature rather than the rigid symmetry of decoration. The craftsmen who worked under the sculptor were among the finest goldsmiths the ancient world had ever produced. Some had trained in workshops that had served the temples of Athens for generations. Their fingers knew gold the way a musician's fingers know the strings of a lyre, by long practice, by daily intimacy, by the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 small decisions made under pressure and preserved in muscle memory. The robes flowed from the god's shoulders, draped across his vast lap, fell to his golden sandals in cascades of light. Some scholars believe that parts of the robes may have been made not of pure gold, but of gilded glass panels covered with gold leaf. The glass would have added rigidity, allowing the robes to maintain their folds and contours without sagging or distorting under their own weight. The gold would have provided the appearance, the warmth, the radiance. From any distance at all, the distinction would have been invisible. The robes would have looked like cloth made of pure gold, which in a sense they were. When light entered the temple through the great doorway, the gold caught it and threw it back in soft waves. The statue seemed to glow from within, as if the figure were itself the source of illumination rather than its recipient. Visitors standing in the dim cellar would see that golden gleam before they could make out any detail. A warm, soft radiance that filled the space. That reached toward them. That seemed to say, "Come closer." Parapet walls surrounded the statue's base, standing perhaps 7 feet high. They concealed the lower portions of the statue from view so that visitors entering the temple would not see the god's feet or the bottom of his throne. Instead, their eyes would be drawn upward toward the golden robes, the ivory hands, the face. The god would have seemed to float in space above the dark pool, luminous, unearthly, divine. And here is the thing about gold in dim light, something that the sculptor understood intuitively, and that modern studies of light and reflection have confirmed. Gold does not simply reflect light the way silver or polished bronze does. Silver gives back a cold white reflection. Bronze returns a warm but sharp gleam. Gold, when the light is low, seems to produce its own illumination, a soft, amber glow that appears to originate from within the metal itself. In the dim interior of the temple, where the only light was whatever filtered through the great doorway, the gold of the god's robes would have seemed to glow like a banked fire, like something alive, like something that had light inside it waiting to be released. Here is something about ivory that the books rarely mention, something that matters more than you might think. Ivory is warm to the touch. Not warm like flesh exactly, not body temperature, but warmer than marble, warmer than bronze, warmer than any other material the ancient sculptors used. When you place your hand against marble, there is a shock of cold, a reminder that you are touching dead stone, however beautifully shaped. When you place your hand against ivory, there is no shock. Instead, there is a gentle yielding, a sensation that is almost like touching living skin. The Greeks knew this. They chose ivory for the skin of their most sacred images, not only because of how it looked, but because of how it felt. On the rare occasions when a priest or servant was permitted to touch the statue, to oil it, to clean it, to repair some small damage, the experience was uncanny. The god's face under their fingers felt not like sculpture but like something closer, something that existed on the boundary between the made and the born, between the crafted and the alive. Perhaps that is why they wept. Not because the statue was beautiful, though it was beautiful beyond description. Not because it was enormous or costly or technically miraculous, but because it was warm, because it was present. Because when they stood close enough in the dim light with the scent of olive oil in the air and the gold catching every stray gleam, the boundary between sculpture and God grew thin. The ivory breathed, the gold rippled. And for one suspended moment, the king of the gods was present, truly, undeniably present, in a way that cold marble could never achieve. And perhaps, what did the king of the gods look like? Not the statue, the god himself. What face should the sculptor give to the ruler of heaven and earth, the father of gods and men, the one who held thunderbolts in his fists and shook the world when he nodded his head? Later writers claimed that Phidias drew his inspiration from Homer, from the great poet who had described the god in the ancient epic, centuries before the statue was conceived. The son of Cronos spoke and bowed his dark brow, and the ambrosial locks waved from the king's immortal head, and he made great Olympus quake. Ambrosial locks, a dark brow, a nod that shook the heavens. From these hints, and from something deeper, some inner vision that no written source could provide, the sculptor created a face. It is worth pausing here to consider what that means. Every sculptor who had ever depicted the king of the gods had faced the same problem. How do you give a face to power itself? How do you carve features that convey not merely strength or beauty, but omniscience, omnipotence, the absolute and unshakable authority of the being who governs all of existence? Other sculptors had tried. Some had made him stern, almost angry, a god of thunderbolts and punishment. Others had made him distant, remote, untouchable, a god too far above humanity to be understood. But Phidias chose a different path. The god was shown as a mature man, perhaps in his 50s, with the full beard that Greek custom associated with wisdom and authority. His hair was thick and curling, bound by a wreath of olive leaves, the olive being sacred to him, the tree that provided oil for lamps and food and the anointing of athletes who competed in his name. His expression was serene but not soft. It conveyed intelligence and patience, the settled confidence of one who holds ultimate power and has held it for so long that the thought of losing it has ceased to have meaning. The eyes looked out at the viewer with a gaze that was both penetrating and benevolent, the gaze of a father who knows his children's weaknesses but loves them nonetheless, who sees their failings and their follies, their cruelties and their kindnesses, and accepts it all. In his right hand, extended palm up toward the viewer, he held a small figure of Nike Victory personified. She was herself a chryselephantine statue, complete in every detail despite her small size relative to the seated god. She wore a ribbon on her head and a garland of flowers. Her wings, if she had them, the sources are not entirely clear, may have been spread as if about to take flight. Victory was the god's to bestow. The small figure in his palm was a gift waiting to be given, a promise extended to those who proved worthy. And the hand itself, open, facing upward, the gesture of offering rather than taking, suggested generosity, benevolence, grace. In his left hand, he gripped a scepter inlaid with every kind of metal, gold and silver, bronze and iron, the mixing of metals creating a surface of varied colours and textures that rewarded close examination. Atop the scepter perched an eagle, his sacred bird, the creature that carried his thunderbolts, that soared through the heavens where no other bird could fly, that represented the far-seeing vision of the divine. The throne was a masterpiece in itself. Cedarwood painted with scenes and figures, ornamented with ebony and ivory, with gold and precious stones, a riot of detail that complemented rather than competed with the figure seated upon it. At each of the thrones, 4 feet danced a figure of Nike, celebrating eternally. 2 more at the base of each foot made 8 in total, 8 winged women in perpetual motion, frozen in the act of dancing, their bodies arched and graceful, their feet seeming about to lift from the surface that held them. Above the god's head, positioned as if attending him, were 6 smaller figures. On one side, the 3 Graces, goddesses of charm and beauty and creativity, their forms intertwined in the traditional pose of mutual embrace, each one leaning toward the others as if sharing a secret that mortals were not meant to hear. On the other, the 3 Seasons, goddesses of the orderly passage of time, each distinguished by the attributes of her domain. Flowers for spring, grain for summer, bare branches for the colder months. Together they represented everything the god stood for: beauty and order, creativity and law, the eternal cycle of growth and harvest and rest that turns the world without ceasing, that brings the olive blossoms in spring and the heavy fruit in autumn and the quiet dormancy of winter, and then begins again. Screens filled the spaces between the throne's legs, and these screens were painted by the sculptor's brother, scenes of the divine hero's labors, scenes of combat and triumph, images that served as backdrop and context for the figure seated above. The brother was a painter of considerable reputation in his own right. In any other context, his work would have been the centerpiece, the reason visitors came, the thing that people talked about when they went home. Here, his paintings were supporting players, details in a composition so vast that any single element of it could have been the crowning achievement of a lesser artist's career. This was the nature of Phidias's vision. It swallowed everything around it. Every contributing artist, every skilled craftsman, every master of a particular technique or material, all of them were absorbed into the larger whole, their individual brilliance serving a purpose greater than any of them could have achieved alone. The front legs of the throne bore images of sphinxes catching children, a strange and haunting detail that ancient viewers would have recognized from myth. The armrests were decorated with figures of legendary warrior women, and with the children of a tragic queen whose boasting cost her all of her sons and daughters. These were dark stories, stories of hubris and punishment, woven into the structure of the throne, as reminders that the god who sat above dispensed not only blessing but judgment. Not only mercy but consequence. Beneath the god's feet rested a footstool decorated with a battle scene, heroes in eternal combat, spears thrusting, shields clashing, bodies twisting and falling in the frozen violence of art. His golden sandals rested upon this scene. The ruler of heaven held victory beneath his very feet. The effect when all these elements were assembled, throne and figure, Nike and scepter, graces and seasons, sphinxes and warrior women, footstool and painted screens, was of a single composition so complex and so unified that the eye could spend hours exploring it and still discover new details. Every surface told a story. Every figure contributed to the meaning of the whole. It was not a throne with decorations, but a complete cosmology rendered in cedar and gold and ivory and precious stone. A map of the Greek universe with the king of the gods at its center, surrounded by everything he governed, everything he protected, everything he held in balance. And yet the eye always returned to the face. The details of the throne were fascinating, absorbing, endlessly rich. But they were the frame. The face was the painting. The calm, bearded, olive-crowned face that looked out over everything with an expression that seemed to contain within it all the authority of heaven and all the tenderness of a father watching his children sleep. And now's the cup. Do you remember the drinking cup found in the workshop? The ordinary clay cup with 5 words inscribed on its bottom. The inscription read, "I belong to Phidias." 5 words, proof that this was indeed the master's workshop. Proof that the ancient accounts were accurate, that the stories were not exaggerated, that in this very building, more than 2,000 years ago, the greatest sculptor in history had sat and drunk and rested and planned his masterpiece. Such a small thing, a cup. You could hold it in one hand, you could drink from it without thinking, and yet it bridges millennia. It connects us tangibly, materially, undeniably to a man who otherwise exists only in the praise of ancient writers. He touched this cup. His lips touched its rim. His fingers curved around its sides. The oil and dust of his workshop clung to his hands when he lifted it. The statue is gone, the gold melted, the ivory burned, but the cup survives. Sometimes it is the smallest things that endure. And here is the secret of the olive oil, the one I mentioned when we first arrived in the valley, the secret of preservation that kept the wonder alive for 800 years. In front of the statue, the floor of the temple held a shallow basin, edged in marble, filled not with water but with olive oil. Dark tiles surrounded it, almost black, so that the oil's surface appeared deeper than it was. The pool served a practical purpose that most visitors never understood. Olympia's climate was humid. The 2 rivers that made the valley so pleasant also made the air damp, especially in summer when the heat coaxed moisture from the earth. Ivory, exposed to such humidity over months and years and decades, could crack and split. The grain would separate. The surface would flake. The beautiful warm skin of the god would slowly destroy itself. The oil in the pool helped maintain the moisture levels in the air around the statue. It was, in essence, an ancient humidifier, designed not with electricity or machinery, but with the patient understanding of materials that comes from centuries of working with them. The oil evaporated slowly, steadily, at a rate calibrated by the size and depth of the pool. It kept the air around the ivory at exactly the right moisture level, not too dry, not too damp. The priests replenished it daily as part of their sacred duties. They did not know the word for humidity, but they understood the principle perfectly. 800 years. The wonder survived for 800 years because someone understood that olive oil and ivory had a relationship, that the tree's gift could preserve the god's skin. That patient, daily care, the kind of care that no one notices, that wins no praise, that happens in the quiet hours before dawn, could keep a miracle alive across centuries. But the pool served another purpose as well. It reflected. Stand before it and look upon its dark surface, and you would see the god looking back at you, doubled, extended, transformed. The already enormous figure seemed to continue downward into the earth itself, as if the seated god you saw was merely the upper half of something even more vast. Something that went on and on, below the floor, below the foundation, below the bedrock, all the way down to wherever gods keep their true selves. The effect was intentional. Phidias understood light and reflection as thoroughly as he understood form and proportion. He designed the pool to amplify the statue, to double its impact, to create a sense of depth and vastness that the physical space alone could not provide. A visitor entering the temple would see not one god but 2, one above, enthroned and golden, and one below, reflected in dark oil, as if there were a second temple beneath the floor. A mirror world where another god sat in another chair and gazed upward through the membrane of the oil's surface at the world of mortals above. The pool was theatre, was magic, was art all at once, indistinguishable from each other. And it was practical engineering, keeping the ivory alive. One device serving two purposes, beauty and function married so completely that you could not separate them. The base of the entire statue was made of dark marble, Eleusinian marble, from the region near Athens where the famous mysteries were celebrated each year. It was a dark stone, almost black, polished to a high sheen. Against it, the gold and ivory of the statue stood out brilliantly, light against dark, divinity against earth, the radiant against the solid. The base was large, nearly 10 meters by 6 meters, according to scholarly reconstructions. It needed to be to support the enormous weight above, but it was also decorated, carved with scenes of a goddess rising from the sea foam, attended by lesser divinities and figures of love, beauty emerging from chaos, order from the deep. And on this base, the sculptor inscribed his signature. Phidias, son of his father, an Athenian, made me. It was a bold claim. Not this statue was commissioned by the Eleans or dedicated to the great god by the people of Elis, but made me. The sculptor took ownership of his creation, placed his name permanently alongside the image of divinity itself. It was the statement of a man who knew what he had achieved, who understood that this work would define him and outlast him, and who wanted there to be no confusion about who was responsible. There was also a secret inscription, a private message hidden in a public masterpiece. The ancient writer Clement preserves this detail for us. According to his account, Phidias inscribed a hidden message on one of the god's fingers, on the little finger of one hand, where it might escape casual notice. The inscription declared that a young wrestler from Elis was beautiful. This young man had won the boys' wrestling competition at Olympia in 436 before the Common Era. He was, according to the ancient sources, someone the sculptor loved, following the customs of his time, when such affections between master and student, between older mentor and younger protégé, were understood as part of the fabric of life, as natural as any other form of devotion. The inscription, if it existed, was an act of love hidden in plain sight. Thousands of pilgrims across centuries would have gazed upon those enormous hands without ever seeing the message carved there. Only those who knew to look, who climbed close enough to read the tiny letters scratched into the ivory of the little finger, would discover the sculptor's secret. Some scholars believe that this young wrestler may also have served as a model for some of the figures on the throne. His youthful form immortalized alongside the gods, his body transformed into art, as the sculptor's affection was transformed into letters carved on ivory. It reminds us that even the greatest works of art emerge from human lives, with all their complications and affections. The man who could envision gods was still a man, capable of love, capable of yearning, capable of wanting to leave a private mark upon a public masterpiece, a whisper hidden inside a shout. The inscription tells us that the sculptor was not merely a conduit for divine vision. He was a human being who worked and loved and wanted to be remembered, not just for his skill, but for his heart. And there is something deeply moving about that, about the greatest sculptor in history at the height of his powers, pausing in his work on the king of the gods to carve a few words of private devotion on a surface that almost no one would ever read. The gesture is so small, so intimate, so profoundly human, that it makes the colossal achievement around it seem more real, not less. It grounds the wonder in something recognizable. It says, "A person made this." A person who loved and who wanted the world to know. When the statue was complete, or nearly so, there came the enormous question of installation. Moving the assembled work from the workshop to the temple, a distance of perhaps 100 meters. Only 100 meters. But those 100 meters had to be traversed without damage, without mishap, without a single accident that might harm years of painstaking work. Think about what this required. The workshop and the temple were not connected by a corridor or a covered passage. Between them lay 100 meters of open ground, sacred ground, ground that had been walked by priests and pilgrims for centuries, but ground nonetheless exposed to the elements, to the wind that swept across the valley, to the sun that could heat exposed ivory until it cracked, to the possibility of rain that could damage surfaces polished over months of painstaking work. The pieces had to be carried outside, exposed to all of these hazards, and then brought inside again through the temple's great doors, which were wide enough for a procession of priests, but not necessarily designed for the passage of objects the size of small buildings. The throne would have gone first in sections. Its 4 massive legs, each one a column of carved and decorated cedar. Its seat and back and armrests, fitted together with joints that had been tested and retested in the workshop until they locked with the precision of puzzle pieces. Then the decorative elements, the screens, the painted panels, the gilded ornaments, each one wrapped and padded and carried with the reverence due to objects that were, in a sense, already sacred. Then the figure itself, piece by careful piece. The legs and feet, the torso, the arms with their precious cargo of Nike and scepter, and finally, last of all, handled with the greatest care, the head. The face of the god, that ivory visage that Phidias had carved to embody everything he understood about divinity, was the last piece to be lifted into place. Imagine the moment, the scaffolding crowded with workers, the sculptor himself perhaps standing below in the dimness, watching as his creation took its final form. The face rising on ropes and pulleys, swaying slightly, the ivory catching whatever light filtered through the doorway. And then contact. The face meeting the framework, the pegs sliding into their prepared holes, the seams closing, the god becoming whole. When it was done, when the final peg was set, the final seam polished smooth, the final adjustment made, the god sat complete upon his throne, in the space that had been waiting for him for 20 years. The workers would have descended from the scaffolding, gathered their tools, stepped back. And for the first time in the dim light of the temple, the statue would have been seen as a whole, not a collection of sections and panels and components, but a single presence. A god, complete. There must have been a moment of silence. There always is when something that has been imagined for years suddenly becomes real. A moment when the workers stood in the dimness, tools still in their hands, dust still on their faces, and looked up at what they had built. Some of them had been with the project from the beginning. They had seen the first cedar beams cut and shaped. They had watched the ivory arrive in crates, wrapped in damp cloth to protect it from cracking. They had held the gold sheets in their hands before those sheets became the robes of a god. And now the thing was done. Complete. Standing before them in the space they had worked in for years, filling it as nothing else could fill it, transforming a room they knew intimately into a place they had never been before. That is what great art does. It makes the familiar strange. It takes a space you have walked through 1,000 times and reveals it as somewhere you have never set foot. The best estimates place this around 435 before the Common Era. Some 20 years after the temple itself was completed. Some 3 years after the sculptor had dedicated the Athena in Athens. The ancient sources suggest that there was a moment of dedication, a ceremony when the statue was finally revealed, when the great doors were opened, and the people of Elis and their guests were invited to behold what their sculptor had created. Imagine the tension of that moment. Years of work, years of expense, years of hope and expectation, all condensed into the instant when the doors swing open and the first light falls upon the seated figure. One story says that Phidias prayed after the dedication, asking for a sign that his work was acceptable. In response, the story says a bolt of lightning struck the temple floor directly before the statue. The sound was deafening, the light was blinding, and then silence and the smell of scorched stone and the fading echo of thunder and the absolute certainty in every heart present that the god had spoken. The spot where the lightning struck, according to the traveller Pausanias who visited centuries later, was ever after marked with a bronze vessel and revered. Visitors would point to it. Guides would tell the story. The scar on the stone floor became part of the wonder, evidence, for those who wanted evidence that the divine had reached down and touched this place. Whether the story is true matters less than what it tells us about how the Greeks understood what had happened. The statue was not meant merely to represent the god. It was meant to be acceptable to him, to please him, to provide him with a dwelling place worthy of his majesty. And the lightning, whether real or imagined, whether divine response or fortunate coincidence, was his answer. Yes, this is enough. This is worthy. The philosopher Dio Chrysostom, visiting the temple centuries later, declared that a single glimpse of the statue would make any mortal forget all the terrors and hardships that fall to our human lot. All of them. Not merely the major sorrows, the deaths of loved ones, the defeats in battle, the failures of ambition, but the small ones too. The ache in the joints, the worry about money, the petty quarrel with a neighbour. All of it dissolved in the presence of the god. Pliny called it a work of art which no one ever equalled. And a Roman teacher of rhetoric wrote something that goes even further. He wrote that the statue had added something to traditional religion, that Phidias had not merely illustrated existing beliefs but had deepened them, had shown humanity something about the divine that they had not known before, something they had always felt but could not articulate, something that had been waiting in the back of every human mind since the beginning of thought, waiting for a sculptor skilled enough to give it form. This was the sculptor's true gift, not merely technical skill, though he possessed that in abundance, not merely the ability to work gold and ivory and cedarwood, materials that any craftsman could buy in the markets of Athens, but vision, the ability to see what a god should look like and to make that vision real, to reach into the place where belief and beauty meet and bring something back and hold it up for others to see. After Phidias, the image of the king of the gods was settled. Before him, there had been many versions, on coins, on vases, in small bronze figurines sold at temple gates. After him, there was essentially one. The bearded, enthroned, majestic figure that he created became the standard. It influenced how the god was depicted for centuries afterward. It influenced eventually how later ages imagined the divine itself. The bearded, enthroned figure of God the Father that appears in countless paintings owes something, distant but real, to what a Greek sculptor created in a valley in the Peloponnese 25 centuries ago. Imagine now that you are a pilgrim. You have travelled far. You have crossed the mountains and the valleys, the rivers and the dusty plains. You have arrived at Olympia during the sacred games, when the sanctuary teems with visitors from every Greek city, from every colony, from every corner of the world that speaks the Greek tongue. The morning is young, the sun has not yet grown hot, You have bathed in the river, the cool waters of the Cladios, and dressed in your finest clothes. A simple tunic, perhaps, but clean and white. You carry a small offering, a cake of honey and barley, or a measure of wine, or a few coins of silver. You approach the temple of Zeus. The morning light falls soft and golden on the white columns. Other visitors are approaching too. You can see them converging from different directions across the sanctuary, all drawn toward the same building, all carrying the same combination of curiosity and reverence and barely suppressed nervousness. You hear fragments of conversation in half a dozen dialects. Someone nearby is speaking in the broad accent of Sparta. Someone else uses the softer tones of the Aegean islands. Despite the differences, they are all speaking the same language. They are all Greek. They are all here for the same reason. From outside, the temple impresses but does not overwhelm. You have seen temples before. This one is larger than most, its columns more numerous, its pediments carved with scenes of gods and heroes. But from the outside, it is still just a building. Limestone and stucco and marble tiles catching the morning light. Beautiful, yes. Impressive, yes, but just a building. You climb the 3 stone steps. The stone is warm already, even this early, heated by yesterday's sun, and holding that warmth through the night like a body holds the memory of an embrace. You pass between the great columns, their surfaces chalky and smooth under your fingertips if you reach out to touch them. You enter the porch, cool and shaded after the brightness outside. The temperature drops. The sound of the sanctuary, the murmur of crowds, the distant chanting of a hymn, the lowing of sacrificial animals, fades behind you, replaced by the particular quiet of enclosed stone. A quiet that is not silence but something denser, more deliberate, as if the air itself has been trained to hold its breath. And then you pass through the great doors into the cellar itself. At first, your eyes cannot adjust. You have stepped from light into shadow. The cellar seems dark, almost cavernous. You blink, you wait. The scent of olive oil reaches you, warm and comforting, like a kitchen you remember from childhood, like a hand on your shoulder in the dark. Slowly, shapes begin to emerge. First, the columns, 2 rows of them, slender and pale, leading your eye forward. Then the dark pool on the floor, still as glass, reflecting what little light there is. And then, gradually, magnificently, impossibly, he fills your vision. He is vast, 40 feet of gold and ivory, rising from a throne that is itself a cathedral of carved cedar and precious stone. He seems to glow from within, catching light from sources you cannot identify, reflecting it back in soft waves of warmth that reach across the entire chamber and touch your face like sunlight through a window. His robes catch the gleam and throw it upward into the shadows of the ceiling. His hair, his beard, his olive wreath, all golden, all luminous, all participating in this soft conspiracy of light. His face is serene. His eyes, you cannot tell at this distance what they are made of, but they seem to look at you. Not past you, not through you, at you. To see you specifically, you alone out of all the visitors who have ever entered this temple. His expression is benevolent but infinitely knowing. The expression of a being who sees all of time and space, who knows the fate of nations and the fall of individual sparrows from individual rooftops. His right hand extends toward you, palm up, and in that palm rests Nike, tiny in comparison, but still larger than life, still magnificent. She offers victory. She offers favor. She offers the promise that the God has noticed you, that your journey was not in vain, that your prayers have been received. His left hand grips the scepter, that staff inlaid with every kind of metal, its surface shimmering with colours you cannot quite separate or name. And atop it perches the eagle, alert, fierce, its head turned slightly, as if it has just heard something in the distance that demands its attention. Ready to carry divine will across the entire world at a moment's notice. His throne rises around him like a second temple, carved and painted and gilded, populated by figures that seem almost to move in the shifting light. The Graces attend him, 3 goddesses of beauty and charm, positioned as if they have just paused in their dancing to listen to something the god has said. The seasons mark his eternal reign, 3 figures representing the orderly passage of time, the cycles that the god governs, the turning of the year that he sets in motion. Dancing figures of Nike celebrate at the base of the throne legs, 8 of them in total, frozen in attitudes of joy that seem, in the dim light, to be actual motion. And painted scenes fill the spaces between the throne's legs with stories of heroism and divine purpose. Stories of the god's own son performing his labours, of heroes struggling against monsters, of the eternal battle between order and chaos that the god oversees from his golden seat. And in the dark pool before him, he is reflected, doubled, extended downward into the earth as if the statue you see is merely the upper half of something even more vast, something that continues below the floor, below the foundation, below the bedrock itself. The god above and the god below gaze at each other across the thin membrane of the oil's surface, and between them, between the gold above and the gold below, you stand. Small, mortal, temporary. Held in the space between 2 eternities. The smell of olive oil is everywhere. It fills your nostrils with each breath, warm, slightly nutty, ancient and familiar. It is the smell of this place, the smell of devotion, the smell of 8 centuries of daily care absorbed into the stone and the wood and the very air itself. You stand still for a long moment. You have forgotten why you came. You have forgotten the offering in your hands, the prayers on your lips, the questions you meant to ask the god about your crops, your family, your chances in tomorrow's competition. All of that has faded before the simple fact of presence. You are standing before a god. Not a representation of a god, not an image or a symbol or a reminder, but the god himself made manifest in gold and ivory, present in a way that transcends material and form, that makes the distinction between sculpture and divinity seem suddenly unimportant. Dio Chrysostom was right. For this moment you have forgotten all the terrors and hardships that fall to our human lot. The worry about money, the argument with your neighbour, the dull ache in your knee, the grief for your father who died last winter, all of it gone. There is only the god, there is only wonder. There is only now. And so they wept. Now you understand why. Not from sorrow, not from joy exactly, but from something that has no name in any language, something that lives in the space between those 2 emotions, something that partakes of both without being either. Something that the philosophers had always spoken of in careful, measured prose, but that could only truly be understood in this moment, in this dim temple, standing before this golden figure who seemed to breathe. The Greeks had a concept they called thaumazein, wonder, astonishment, the emotion that arrives when the world reveals itself to be larger and more mysterious than you had believed. It was, they thought, the beginning of all philosophy, the moment when the mind stops calculating and simply opens. The tears were a physical expression of that opening. They had glimpsed something real beyond the everyday, something true beyond the merely factual. They had felt, if only for an instant, what it might be like to stand in the presence of something genuinely greater than themselves, something that was not trying to impress them, not demanding anything from them, but simply existing. Existing with a completeness and a calm that made their own small, busy, worried lives seem both infinitely important and infinitely small. The tears were not a weakness, they were a recognition that beauty of this magnitude requires a response, and that the only honest response, the only response that does not diminish the experience by trying to contain it in words, is the one that the body provides on its own, without asking the mind's permission. The pilgrim weeps. The general weeps. The philosopher who thought he understood everything discovers that understanding and experiencing are different countries, separated by a border that can only be crossed in one direction at a time. And afterward, walking back out into the bright Greek morning, blinking in the sun, rejoining the crowds and the noise and the ordinary business of the world, they carry something with them. Something that has changed the way they see everything else. The morning light hits you like water, bright and sudden after the dimness of the interior. You stand on the temple steps, blinking, adjusting, feeling the warmth of the sun on your face and the slight breeze that carries the scent of wild thyme from the hillside above. The world seems different, not altered in any way you could describe or measure, but different nonetheless. The olive trees are more green than they were an hour ago. The sky is more blue. The faces of strangers seem kinder, more interesting, more worthy of attention. The statue has not given them information. It has not taught them a lesson. It has given them something far more valuable and far less articulable, a recalibration of the soul. A reminder of what is possible when human hands work in service of something larger than human ambition. Some things cannot be said, they can only be experienced, and then they can only be remembered, imperfectly, like a dream that fades as you reach for it. The statue stood for more than 800 years. Think of what that means. Try to hold 800 years in your mind like a length of rope stretched between your hands. Feel how it sags in the middle, how its weight pulls at your fingers, how it seems to extend beyond what your arms can hold. 800 years ago from our own time, the great cathedrals of Europe had not yet been built. The universities of Oxford and Paris were in their infancy. The Renaissance was centuries away. The printing press would not be invented for another 400 years. Nearly everything we think of as the modern world did not yet exist. And yet the statue of Phidias was already ancient. When it was first dedicated, around 435 before the Common Era, the great age of Athens was just ending. Pericles was still alive, though not for much longer. A plague would take him within a few years. The philosopher Socrates walked the streets of the city, asking his uncomfortable questions. The terrible war between Athens and Sparta, the war that would exhaust and diminish all of Greece, had not yet begun. 100 years after the statue's dedication, a young conqueror from the north, a student of Aristotle, a man who dreamed of reaching the edge of the world, would build an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. Greek language and culture would spread across 3 continents, and still the statue sat in its temple at Olympia, unchanged, while the world around it transformed utterly. Another 100 years. Rome was rising in the west. The Greek city-states were falling one by one under Roman control. The balance of power in the Mediterranean was shifting toward a people who spoke a different language, worshipped different gods, or rather, the same gods by different names. And still the statue sat, and still the pilgrims came. Generations were born and died, empires rose and fell, wars were fought and peace was made and wars were fought again, technologies advanced, philosophies shifted. The very shape of the known world changed utterly as explorers and conquerors pushed the boundaries of the map outward in every direction. Every 4 years, without fail, the games continued. The sacred truce was proclaimed. The heralds travelled to every Greek city. Athletes came to compete, crowds came to watch, and at the centre of it all, in his dim temple, the god sat on his golden throne, and people came to weep before him. Imagine the athletes of those later centuries arriving at Olympia to compete. They had trained for years. They had sacrificed comfort and pleasure for discipline and pain. Before they stepped onto the sand of the stadium, before they took their places at the starting line, they went to the temple. They entered the dim interior. They stood before the statue and prayed, not for victory, which would be presumptuous, but for the strength to compete well, for the endurance to finish, for the grace to accept whatever outcome the god decreed. They looked up at Nike in the god's palm, and they thought of what it would mean to receive her favour, to stand crowned with the olive wreath, to hear their name proclaimed before all of Greece, to return home in triumph. The wreath was made from the branches of the sacred wild olive tree that grew near the temple, just leaves and twigs, nothing of material value, but worth more to a Greek athlete than all the gold in the treasury. An Olympic victor was celebrated for life. Poets composed odes in his honour. His city granted him privileges, free meals at public expense, a reserved seat at festivals, the respect and gratitude of all his fellow citizens. His name was carved in stone, recorded in the official lists, remembered for centuries. But they also knew that most who compete do not win. They knew that the god would choose his champions according to his own will, not according to their desires or their training or their prayers. They knew that their task was not to demand victory, but to deserve it, to compete with honour, to give everything they had, and to accept whatever the god decreed. And so they bowed their heads, completed their prayers, and turned to face whatever came. Through all of this, through revolution and evolution, through catastrophe and triumph, the god sat on his golden throne. The Romans came as conquerors, but they came also as admirers. They had subjugated Greece, but they loved Greek culture, loved it with the possessive, overwhelming love of someone who has destroyed the thing they cannot stop wanting. They learned the Greek language. They adopted Greek gods under Roman names. They hired Greek tutors for their children, and they made pilgrimages to Olympia. The general Aemilius Paulus visited in 167 before the Common Era, fresh from his victory over a powerful northern kingdom. He came not to conquer, there was nothing left to conquer but to pay homage, to see the statue that all the world spoke of. According to the historians, he was moved to his very soul when he beheld it. He felt, he said, as if he had seen the god in person. He declared that the sculptor had captured the god exactly as Homer had described him in the ancient poems, majestic and benevolent and infinitely powerful. Other Romans followed. The great orator Cicero wrote of the statue's perfection. Generals and emperors made the journey and were moved, and went away carrying something they had not brought with them, a new understanding of what art could achieve, a new appreciation for the civilization they had conquered, a new humility before the evidence that the Greeks had reached heights that Rome, for all its power, could not easily match. The historian Herodotus, though he wrote before the statue was made, described the temple and the sanctuary in terms that made later visitors eager to see the god for themselves. And the traveller Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, devoted pages and pages to describing every detail he could observe, the materials, the dimensions, the subjects of the painted panels, the figures on the throne. Without his account, much of what we know about the statue would be lost entirely. Not every Roman came in reverence. The emperor of the Romans called Caligula ascended to the throne in 37 of the Common Era. He was unstable, brilliant perhaps, but cruel, erratic, prone to bizarre whims that his absolute power allowed him to indulge without restraint or consequence. He had decided that he himself was a god, not would become one after death, as Roman emperors were sometimes deified. Was one, now living, entitled to worship. He wanted the statue at Olympia. He ordered it brought to Rome. His plan was to remove the divine head and replace it with a portrait of his own face. The king of gods would become a monument to the emperor's vanity. Workers were dispatched, preparations began, scaffolding was erected around the seated figure. And then, the ancient sources say, something strange happened. As the workers prepared to begin dismantling the statue, the giant figure suddenly emitted a roar of laughter. The sound was so loud, so unexpected, so unmistakably derisive that the scaffolding collapsed from the vibration. The workers fled in terror, refusing to return. Whether the story is true, whether the statue actually laughed, whether there was an earthquake or a structural collapse that the storytellers reinterpreted, the outcome was the same. Caligula was assassinated by his own guards in 41 of the Common Era. His plans for the statue died with him. The god remained in his temple, untouched, unviolated, still gazing serenely over the olive groves and the sacred games as he had gazed for centuries before the Romans arrived and would continue to gaze for centuries after. The scaffolding was removed, the workers were sent home, and the god sat as he had always sat, in perfect stillness, in perfect patience, waiting for the next pilgrim to enter and be transformed. The story of Caligula's attempt became part of the legend of the statue, told and retold in marketplaces and dining rooms across the empire. The god who laughed at an emperor, the wonder that could not be moved by mortal ambition. It added another layer to the aura of the sacred, the sense that the statue was not merely a great work of art but something more, something protected by powers that even an emperor could not override. Through all of this, through all the centuries and the empires and the changes, the priests maintained their vigil. Every day without fail, year after year, century after century, someone climbed the scaffolding behind the statue and rubbed olive oil into the ivory surfaces. The face, the hands, the feet, not mere polishing but preservation. Without the oil, the ivory would dry in the changing seasons. It would crack, it would split. The skin of the god would fall away in flakes and shards, revealing the cedarwood skeleton beneath. Imagine being one of those servants. Every morning before the first light crept through the temple doors, rising from your sleeping quarters near the sanctuary, gathering your supplies, soft cloths, a vessel of the finest olive oil pressed from the trees of the sacred grove, making your way through the pre-dawn darkness, guided by habit and by the sound of the rivers. You enter the temple by a side door. You light a single lamp, just enough to see by, not enough to disturb the sacred gloom. You approach the statue. In the lamplight it seems almost alive. The gold gleams softly. The ivory catches the flickering flame. Shadows play across the features, suggesting movement, suggesting breath. You climb the scaffolding. Carefully, reverently, you begin your work, oil into the forehead, oil into the cheeks, oil around the eyes where the finest cracks are always the first to appear. You work around the golden beard, careful not to disturb its delicate edges. You tend to the hands, those enormous hands, the fingers, the nails, the subtle veins that the sculptor carved to suggest the flow of blood beneath the surface. It is intimate work, sacred work. You are touching a god. As you work, you might speak to him, not aloud, but in your heart you tell him of your hopes and fears. You are closer to the god in these quiet morning hours than any pilgrim will ever be. And when you are done, you descend, extinguish your lamp and slip away before the first visitors arrive. Your work is invisible, but without it the wonder would fade. History remembers the god, it forgot the man. Not Phidias, him history remembers well enough, but the servant, the one who climbed the scaffolding each morning in the dark, the one who kept the oil warm in winter so it would not congeal against the cold ivory, the one who noticed, after years of touching the same surfaces, that a hairline crack was forming near the god's left eye, and reported it, and watched as repairs were made with tiny pegs of ivory no bigger than a grain of rice. We do not know his name. We do not know any of their names, the hundreds or thousands of men and women who, across 8 centuries, performed this single quiet act of devotion. They are the invisible foundation of the wonder. Without them, the sculptor's masterpiece would have lasted a generation, perhaps 2, before the climate and the years reduced it to ruin. History remembers the artist who created the wonder. It remembers the generals and philosophers who stood in awe before it. It remembers the emperor who tried to steal it and the god who laughed. But the servant with the oil cloth, climbing the scaffolding before dawn, speaking to the god in the silence of the heart, him it forgot. Perhaps that is always the way. The most essential work is the least visible. The most necessary devotion is the kind no one notices, the kind that happens every day without exception, without applause, without the prospect of being recorded in any book or carved on any stone. And then the world changed, as worlds do. In 380 of the Common Era, the Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. The old gods were to be abandoned. The temples were to be closed. The sacrifices that had continued for 1,000 years and more were to cease forever. For Olympia, this was catastrophic. The sanctuary existed to honor the old gods. The games were held in their name. Without the religious framework, without the sacrifices and the prayers and the sense of sacred purpose, what was Olympia? A stadium in a valley, a collection of old buildings, a relic of a world that no longer existed, tended by priests whose god had been declared illegal. The traditional date for the end of the Olympic Games is 393 of the Common Era, the year after Theodosius issued his final edict against the old forms of worship. Some scholars believe the games continued a few years longer, clinging to life through inertia and tradition, and the stubbornness of people who could not imagine a world without them. Perhaps a handful of athletes still came, still competed, still ran the ancient course in the stadium even as the altars went cold, and the priests departed one by one. But by the early 5th century, the games were certainly over. After more than 1,000 years, the sacred truce fell silent. No more heralds travelled the Greek world proclaiming peace. No more athletes gathered beneath the hill of Kronos to take their oaths before the god. No more crowds filled the sanctuary, that great seasonal migration of humanity. thousands upon thousands of people coming from every corner of the Mediterranean world to cheer and pray and celebrate and feel, for a few days, that they were part of something larger than themselves. The last olive wreath was woven and placed upon a victor's head. The last hymn was sung before the altar. The last sacrifice was offered. And then, silence, the kind of silence that falls when something that has always been stops being. Not a loud silence, not the dramatic silence of a door slamming or a bell ceasing to ring, but the gradual, creeping silence of abandonment. The silence of a building that is still standing but that no one enters anymore. The silence of a path that is still there but that no one walks. The temple stood in that silence. Or perhaps not entirely silent. The god was still there, seated on his throne, gazing at nothing. At empty air. At a chamber that no one entered anymore, in a sanctuary that no one maintained, in a world that had decided his time was over. The olive oil pool before him would have dried, eventually no one to refill it, no one to check its level each morning. The ivory of his skin would have begun to crack, slowly, in the changing seasons. No one to rub oil into the surfaces. No one to catch the hairline fractures before they widened into ruin. The gold would have lasted, gold always lasts. But without the care that had preserved the whole for 8 centuries, the statue would have begun slowly to decay. The ivory flaking. The cedarwood drying and splitting beneath its golden shell. The pegs and joints loosening as the wood shrank. The god was dying not all at once, not dramatically, but by degrees, by inches, by the slow accumulation of mornings when no one came. Imagine the last priest, the last one who stayed after the others had gone retired or died, or simply walked away when it became clear that the world they had served no longer existed. Imagine him making his rounds in a sanctuary that was emptying, building by building, altar by altar. The treasuries had been looted or locked. The lesser temples were closed. The great altar of ashes, built up over 1,000 years of sacrifice, stood cold and grey, no longer fed by the burning of offerings. But the priest still came to the temple each morning. He still opened the side door, still lit his lamp, still climbed the scaffolding with his cloths and his vessel of oil. He still rubbed oil into the ivory face of the god, even though no visitors came to see it, even though no one paid him to do it, even though the world outside had declared his work meaningless and his god dead. He did it because it was what he had always done, because the ivory still needed oil, because the face of the god in the lamplight still seemed to look at him with something like recognition, something like gratitude, because as long as he tended the statue was alive. As long as someone cared, the wonder persisted, and to stop caring, to walk away, to let the ivory crack and the gold tarnish and the cedar wood dry, would be to admit that the god was truly gone. That the world they had built together, the world of sacred groves and olive wreaths and the sacred truce and the hymns at dawn, was over. Finished, never coming back. He was not ready to admit that, not yet. And then one morning the priest did not come. Perhaps he died, perhaps he finally gave up. The record is silent. But one morning, for the first time in 800 years, no one oiled the ivory. And the next morning no one came either, and the morning after that. And the god sat in silence, in a temple that no one entered, and the air grew dry, and the ivory began, so slowly, so quietly, to crack. The olive oil pool would have been the first thing to go. Without daily replenishment, the oil would evaporate faster in summer, slower in winter, but always diminishing, always shrinking, the dark surface pulling back from its marble edges like a tide going out. And as the oil disappeared, the humidity it had maintained would change. The air around the ivory would become drier, more hostile, less forgiving. The cracks would have started small, hairline fractures invisible from the ground, appearing first in the areas of greatest stress, the cheeks, where the ivory had been bent most sharply over the wooden form, the fingers where the plates were thinnest, the forehead where the olive wreath met the ivory and created a line of tension. In the old days, these cracks would have been caught immediately, noticed by the servant during the morning oiling, reported, repaired with tiny pegs and careful adhesives before they could widen. But now there was no servant, no one to notice, no one to care. The cracks widened slowly in the silence of the empty temple, and there was no hand to stop them. What happened to the statue? The ancient sources give us conflicting accounts, and the truth, if there is a single truth, may never be known. One tradition holds that the statue remained in the temple until 426 of the Common Era, when Theodosius II, grandson of the first, equally determined to erase the old world, ordered the temple destroyed. Fire consumed the building, the gold melted, the ivory cracked in the heat, the cedarwood framework burned, and the wonder was gone. But another tradition tells a different story. According to this account, the statue was removed from Olympia around 395 of the Common Era, shortly after the Games ended, and transporting to Constantinople, the great city that had become the new capital of the Roman world. Think about what this journey would have required. The statue would have had to be disassembled. The same pieces that Phidias had so carefully joined would have been separated, wrapped, padded, loaded onto carts. The journey overland to the nearest port would have taken days, along roads that had not been properly maintained for decades. Then by ship across the Aegean, through waters that were not always safe, through the narrow straits and into the harbour of the greatest city on earth. Months of travel, months of risk, for a treasure that had not left its temple in 8 centuries. Constantinople was a Christian city, but its wealthy citizens were not above appreciating the art of the old world. Many Greek masterpieces found their way to the new capital, housed in palaces and private collections, admired for their beauty even as their religious significance was denied or mocked or simply ignored. The statue, according to this tradition, was placed in the palace of Lausus, a private collection assembled by a wealthy court official who gathered the masterpieces of the dying pagan world the way other men gathered coins or land. There it stood among other salvaged treasures, other statues, other remnants of other temples, other gods whose worshippers had been silenced. Stripped of its religious meaning, reduced to a curiosity, a beautiful, bewildering reminder of a world that was slipping away. Imagine the statue in that palace, no longer in its temple, no longer surrounded by the olive groves and the rivers, by the sacred precinct and the stadium, by all the context that had given it meaning. Standing instead in a private room among other masterpieces, admired for its beauty but no longer worshipped, no longer feared, no longer capable of making men weep. Or was it, perhaps even in that alien setting, stripped of everything, temple and pool, priests and pilgrims, the scent of olive oil and the sound of prayers, perhaps even there the statue retained something, some residue of divinity, some lingering power. Perhaps visitors to the palace still stopped before it and felt something stir in their chests, something they could not name. And there, in 475 of the Common Era, it was destroyed by fire. A fire broke out in the palace. These things happened often in the ancient world, where buildings were heated by open flames and lit by oil lamps, and where a single overturned vessel could ignite a conflagration that no one had the tools to stop. The flames spread quickly, as flames do when they find dry wood and oil-soaked fabric and centuries of accumulated combustible material. The building was consumed, and everything within it. If the statue was there, and we must say if because certainty is beyond us, it burned, think of what that means for a moment. The gold melted, because gold melts at temperatures well within the range of a building fire. It ran in streams across the marble floor, pooling in the cracks between tiles, cooling into shapeless puddles that bore no resemblance to the robes and sandals and olive wreath that Phidias had shaped with such care. The ivory turned to ash. 800 years of daily oiling rendered meaningless in minutes, as the flames consumed what generations of devotion had preserved. The cedarwood framework, that skeleton of aromatic wood that had supported the gods' weight across centuries, burned hot and fast, fueled by the very oil that had protected the ivory it carried. And the face, that ivory face that had gazed serenely over 8 centuries of human prayer and human striving and human tears. That face that generals and philosophers had looked upon and wept. It cracked in the heat. It blackened. It fell away from the wooden form beneath, and the wooden form caught fire, and the fire consumed everything. And when morning came, there was nothing left but smoke and ash and the formless residue of what had once been a wonder of the world. 800 years of wonder ended in a single night. Nothing more is required of you. Not attention, not memory, not even wakefulness. If you have drifted, that is as it should be. The story was meant to carry you, not hold you. If you are still here, still listening, that is fine too, but nothing is asked of you. Nothing is expected. The story is nearly done. The god has had his time. The sculptor has had his mystery. The servant with the oilcloth has been remembered, however briefly. What remains now is quieter, the aftermath, the long silence, and then the slow return of memory. Rest if you wish, the voice will still be here, either way. What became of the master sculptor? The ancient sources tell contradictory stories, and none of them end well. We know that Phidias was caught up in the political turmoil of Athens. His friend and patron Pericles had enemies, powerful men who resented his dominance, who sought to bring him down by attacking those closest to him. And one of those close associates was the greatest sculptor alive. Around 432 before the Common Era, the sculptor was accused of theft. His enemies claimed that he had stolen gold intended for the Athena, that he had skimmed from the precious materials entrusted to him by the city, enriching himself at public expense. But the sculptor was clever. He had anticipated such accusations, perhaps because he knew the political climate, perhaps because he understood that wealth of that magnitude always attracts suspicion. He had designed the statue so that all its golden parts could be removed and weighed. The gold was weighed. It matched the records exactly. Every sheet, every panel, every gilded surface accounted for to the last fraction. The accusation failed. His enemies tried again. This time the charge was impiety, a crime the Athenians took very seriously, as they had demonstrated when they executed Socrates for the same offence a generation later. They claimed the sculptor had committed sacrilege by including portraits of himself and Pericles among the figures on the goddess Athena's shield. Mortal faces in a divine context, an insult to the goddess, an act of blasphemous pride. This accusation was harder to refute. He was thrown into prison. What happened next, we cannot say for certain. One source says he died there in an Athenian jail. His life ended by enemies he could not overcome, by a political system that consumed its greatest citizens as readily as its worst. Another source says he escaped or was released, that he fled Athens for Elis, that he completed the statue of the god as an exile from his home city, working in a foreign land because his own had turned against him. A third source, more troubling still, says that after completing the work at Olympia, the sculptor was executed by the Eleans themselves, though for what crime and under what circumstances the record is silent. Perhaps they feared that a man who could make gods might also unmake them. Perhaps the politics of Elis were as treacherous as those of Athens. Perhaps the story is simply wrong, a confusion, a copying error, a rumour that hardened into history over centuries of retelling. The discovery of his workshop at Olympia confirms that he did work there. The cup with his name proves his physical presence. But whether he lived to see his masterpiece installed in the temple, whether he stood before it in the dimness and looked up at the face he had carved and thought, "Yes, this is what I meant. This is the god as I imagined him," we cannot say. What we can say is that his work survived him. For more than 8 centuries after his death, however it came, the statue stood, awe-inspiring generation after generation, drawing pilgrims from across the known world, proving year after year that a single human being working with gold and ivory and cedarwood could create something that brought other human beings to tears. He achieved what he set out to achieve. He showed humanity what a god could look like. And in doing so, in creating something so magnificent that it survived in memory for 2,000 years after its physical destruction, he became something close to immortal himself. The ancient world knew him simply as Phidias. They did not need to add qualifiers or explanations. His name was enough. In the same way that a later age would say Leonardo and everyone would know who was meant, the ancient Greeks said Phidias and the conversation required no further clarification. He was the sculptor, the one, the only. Today, the site of Olympia lies in the western Peloponnese, surrounded by hills and olive groves much as it was in the time of the Games. The temple is gone. Earthquakes toppled its columns in the 6th century of the Common Era, great drums of limestone crashing to the earth, rolling and settling where they fell. Then the rivers did what rivers do. They flooded. They deposited silt. Layer after layer, year after year, century after century, they buried the ruins. The temple, the workshop, the great altar of ashes, the stadium where athletes once ran, all of it disappeared beneath meters of mud and debris. For more than 1,000 years, the site lay hidden, preserved beneath the earth like a letter sealed in an envelope and forgotten in a drawer, known only from ancient texts that described a wonder no one living had ever seen. In the 18th century, an English traveller identified the location. More than 100 years after that, German archaeologists began the systematic excavations that continue to this day. They found the fallen columns of the temple, lying in rows where the earthquakes had thrown them, still in sequence, still in order, as if they had simply decided after 2,000 years of standing to lie down. They found the foundations of the workshop where the master created his masterpiece. They found the moulds and the tools. They found the cup. But of the statue itself, nothing remains. No fragment of gold, no sliver of ivory, not even the dark marble base with the sculptor's signature. The most magnificent sculpture the ancient world ever produced has vanished as completely as if it had never existed. What we have instead are words. The descriptions of Pausanias, who saw the statue in the 2nd century of the Common Era and recorded every detail he could observe: the dimensions, the materials, the images on the throne, the figures on the base. The testimonies of Dio, Chrysostom and Strabo, of Pliny and the Roman historians, who tried to capture in language what they had experienced in that dim temple. We have coins that bear the statue's image, tiny representations of that colossal figure, struck in silver and bronze, circulated throughout the ancient world. They show us the rough outline, the seated figure, the extended hand, the scepter, but they cannot show us the gold or the ivory or the warmth. We have the workshop with its molds and tools, telling us how the statue was made, even if they cannot tell us what it truly looked like. And we have the impact. For 8 centuries, the statue shaped how humans imagined divinity. Its influence extended into the art that followed: the bearded, enthroned figure of the divine that appears in paintings across later centuries owes something to what the sculptor created at Olympia. The very idea that art can capture the sacred, can make the invisible visible, can bridge the gap between human hands and the things that human hands can never touch. This idea was given form in a green valley between 2 rivers in the western Peloponnese. The statue is gone, but its echo persists. If you visit Olympia now, you will find a peaceful place. The archaeological site spreads across the valley floor, its ancient buildings reduced to foundations and scattered stones. Wildflowers grow among the ruins, poppies and daisies and wild anemones, pushing up through the cracks in ancient pavement. Cicadas sing in the olive trees, that constant buzzing chorus of the Greek summer. The rivers still flow as they have flowed for millennia, the Alpheus broad and gentle, the Cladios smaller, cooler, joining its waters to the larger stream. The temple is marked by its fallen columns, massive drums of limestone lying in rows where the earthquakes threw them, overgrown with lichen, warm in the sun. One column has been partially reconstructed, its segments fitted back together, rising again toward the sky as a reminder of what once stood here, and as an admission that what once stood here can never fully be restored. And in the museum nearby you can see the artifacts, the terracotta molds, the ivory fragments, the small clay cup that bears the sculptor's name. They are modest things, quiet things, but they are real, tangible connections to a wonder that is otherwise only a story told in a dim room to someone who may or may not still be awake. Every 4 years before the modern Olympic Games begin, a flame is lit at Olympia. Actresses dressed as ancient priestesses use a parabolic mirror to catch the rays of the Greek sun, kindling a fire that is then carried by relay, hand to hand, torch to torch, across borders and oceans, to wherever the games are held. The flame burns throughout the competition, a link between the modern spectacle and its ancient origins. It is not the same, of course. The modern games lack the religious dimension that made the ancient contests meaningful. There is no god watching from a golden throne. There is no temple to enter, no olive wreath to receive, no sacred truce silencing the wars of nations. But something persists, the idea that human beings can come together in peaceful competition, the idea that excellence deserves celebration, the idea that there is something sacred, even if we no longer use that word, even if we are not sure what we mean by it, about pushing the limits of what we can achieve. These ideas were born at Olympia, in the shadow of the god. Perhaps you were already dreaming when we spoke of the olive oil pool, that dark mirror at the god's feet, doubling his image, extending him downward into the earth, a humidifier disguised as theology, a practical solution dressed in the clothing of awe. Perhaps you drifted off when the sculptor inscribed his secret message on the god's little finger. A few words of love, hidden in plain sight, waiting 2,000 years for someone to notice. Perhaps you were somewhere far from here when the lamplight caught the ivory face each morning, and the servant's cloth moved gently across surfaces that had been tended without interruption for 800 years. Without a single day's neglect, without a single morning skipped. It does not matter. The story will be here when you return. It does not expire. It does not fade. Like the rivers that still flow through that valley in the Peloponnese, it simply continues a patient, unhurried waiting for whoever comes next. The rivers murmur in the darkness. The Alpheus, the Cladios. Ancient names for ancient waters, flowing as they have always flowed, carrying the silence of the valley toward the distant sea. Let their sound carry you. Let the story dissolve into the sound of water over stone, into the rustle of olive leaves in a wind that has not stopped blowing for 3,000 years, into the deep, patient silence of a valley where something extraordinary once stood, and where the memory of that standing still shapes the air. You do not need to remember any of this. The names and the dates, the stories and the details, let them drift away, like leaves on the Alpheus, like silt carried downstream, like the slow burial that covered everything, that preserved everything, that kept the secret safe until the time came to dig it up again. Phidias Olympia, the god on his golden throne. Just sounds now, just syllables, just the fading echo of a fading dream. The night air is cool. It carries the scent of olive trees, of wild herbs, of distant flowers. It has travelled across the valley, gathering sweetness as it came, gathering age, gathering the accumulated fragrance of a place that has been growing and dying and growing again for longer than anyone can remember. Breathe it in. Let it fill your lungs, your body, your being. The stars turn slowly overhead. The same stars that the sculptor saw when he stepped out of his workshop at the end of a long day, his fingers stained with gold leaf, his mind full of the face he was trying to create. The same stars that the pilgrims saw, lying on the ground outside the sanctuary, too excited to sleep before the games began. The same stars that the servant saw walking to the temple before dawn, his vessel of oil balanced carefully in his hands. They are indifferent to us, the stars. They do not care about our temples or our statues, our wonders or our ruins. They simply burn, as they have burned for billions of years, as they will burn for billions more. And yet there is comfort in their constancy. What the ancients saw we see. What we see our descendants will see. The thread of starlight connects us all, the sculptor and the servant, the pilgrim and the general, the last priest who closed the temple doors and the first archaeologist who opened them again, centuries later, to find everything exactly where the earthquake had left it. In the temple, if we can still imagine the temple standing, and we can, the imagination does not require permission, the god sits in darkness. His golden robes do not gleam, there is no light to catch them. His ivory face is invisible, there is no eye to see it. The pool before him reflects nothing. The throne beneath him is silent. The 8 dancing figures of Nike have stopped their celebration, waiting for a morning that for them will never come. And yet he is there. Present, patient, waiting for a dawn that for him will never come again. What does the god think about in the deep watches of the night? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps gods do not think as mortals do. Perhaps they simply exist, perfect and unchanging, in an eternal present that knows neither past nor future. Perhaps everything. Perhaps the god holds all moments simultaneously, the first prayer and the last, the sculptor's hands and the servant's cloth, the pilgrim's tears and the fire that consumed it all. It does not matter. What matters is the stillness. The perfect, absolute stillness of a god at rest. You too can be still. Still as the statue, still as the temple, still as the ancient stones that held their places for centuries, and then let go and were buried and were found again, and now lie quiet under open sky in a valley where two rivers meet. Let your body settle into wherever it rests. Let your breath slow to the rhythm of the rivers. Let your thoughts fade like the last light of sunset, falling across a temple that no longer stands, illuminating a god who no longer sits, in a valley that remains, green and quiet between the hills. The olive trees stand silent in the darkness. Their roots go deep into the earth, down through layers of soil and stone, down to where the water flows in hidden channels, down to where the darkness is complete and permanent and warm. They do not think, they do not worry about the future or regret the past. They simply are, rooted, present, alive in a way that transcends thought entirely. To be like the olive tree. Rooted, still, producing nothing, requiring nothing, simply resting in the earth that holds you, under the sky that covers you, in the night that has gathered around you, like a blanket woven from silence and stars. The Altis flows through the darkness. It has been flowing since before there were humans to name it. It will flow long after the last human is gone. It does not know where it comes from or where it goes. It simply flows. Let yourself be like the river. Let the sounds of the day flow past you. Let the thoughts and worries be carried away. Let yourself become the flow itself, continuous, unhurried, at peace. There is nothing to hold onto. There is nothing that needs to be held. There is only the flow, the endless flow, carrying you gently toward rest. The archive closes for tonight. Rest well. Rest well. They do not think, they do not worry about the future or regret the past. They simply are, rooted, present, alive in a way that transcends thought entirely. To be like the olive tree. Rooted, still, producing nothing, requiring nothing, simply resting in the earth that holds you, under the sky that covers you, in the night that has gathered around you, like a blanket woven from silence and stars. The Altis flows through the darkness. It has been flowing since before there were humans to name it. It will flow long after the last human is gone. It does not know where it comes from or where it goes. It simply flows. Let yourself be like the river. Let the sounds of the day flow past you. Let the thoughts and worries be carried away. Let yourself become the flow itself, continuous, unhurried, at peace. There is nothing to hold onto. There is nothing that needs to be held. There is only the flow, the endless flow, carrying you, gently, toward rest. The archive closes for tonight. Rest well.